Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are today. Thank you for joining us for another edition of CIONET's Spotlight, where each week we put a digital leader somewhere in the world in the spotlight. And today I'm delighted to welcome Scott Dufour. Scott is the CIO of FLEETCOR, and he's joining us today from Atlanta, Georgia. For those of you who don't know FLEETCOR, it started out in the fuels payment industry. It was a small startup 20 years ago. Then it went into private equity, and Advent, Bain Capital, and others have taken majority stakes in it. About 2010, it went public. Today, it's about $3 billion in revenue across North America, Europe, South America, Brazil specifically, and about 8,000 employees. And it's now moving squarely into the B2B payment space. Scott, by way of background, started out with an engineering degree from the University of Michigan, go Wolverines. Latterly joined Accenture a number of years as a consultant, technology consultant. Then went and worked in chemicals, a couple different startups. Very strong supply chain technology DNA in his background. Ingram Micro, the $50 billion a year IT distributor. He was in senior IT leadership roles there. McKesson also, gosh, that's got to be a $30, $40, $50 billion business in pharmaceutical and medical distribution. More technology roles there. He was also CIO of McKesson Europe. Spent some time in Germany in that capacity, and for the last couple of years at FLEETCOR. So really looking forward to having this conversation with Scott here in the next 30 minutes. Scott, what did I leave out in that introduction? What piece would you like to help fill in?
No, when you listed all that, I just feel old now. Given everything, I think you covered it pretty well, Mark.
Thanks, and really looking forward to this because you've in the historical fleet and fueling business you've been in. Let's look back for a year. As the pandemic hit, it's March of 2020. I assume that a lot of your it's a mobility business, so a lot of that had some bumps. You probably had some spikes in home delivery and grocery and some of those kind of segments. But I suspect also you had some bumpiness along the way. From a business perspective, what happened in 2020, and then what was the stance that IT took against that business?
It was really interesting when the pandemic first hit. Part of our first challenge, if you look at the payments industry, and a large part of what we do on the credit card side is around liquidity, right? And so the first question was, hey, how do we ensure that we're going to get payments from our customers, and who do we want to sign up as new customers, just because you don't know how this pandemic's going to affect people's businesses. And so there was a lot of focus at the front end, I don't want to say on shutting down sales, but being very critical on new customers and evaluating the current customer base and how they're doing what you want to do. So and we certainly saw a slowdown in our business. As you mentioned, we've diversified away from fuel cards. We do quite a bit on the B2B payments, travel and expense, lodging, airline industry. All industries hard hit, right? So we saw an immediate drop off in several of those business segments. Specifically on the fuel side, it was interesting in that it was you did have some spikes on certain segments as you continued to have the critical supply chain around food. And we all saw the grocery side, spike up in terms of what people were doing, stocking up on toilet paper, if you remember, back, a year ago, and paper towels and Clorox wipes. So certainly there was, certain customers that did well, but others that didn't. And as an interesting side note, I had a colleague of mine that worked for UPS, and I joked, I said, "Oh, your business must be doing great." And really, from a supply chain perspective, they were struggling initially because their supply chain changed. It was a lot of small package stuff being delivered to homes. So they had to quickly pivot with their systems and with their processes to say, how do we optimize around that? Because our previous optimization routines don't work. They did that very well, but that was an interesting side note as well, if you just look at the supply chain. I'd say the other interesting thing for us is, obviously everyone had to deal with the whole work from home shift. And when you're in the payments business, PCI is a big concern for us, not just with ourselves, but with some of our third-party people. So as we look to enable people to work from home, we had to be very aware of that and look at our processes and what things we didn't want our call center people doing anymore because they were no longer in a PCI environment with cameras and in a secure environment. So obviously the work from home enablement was a big push for us. And, we all have disaster recovery and BCP plans, but nobody had a pandemic. Very few people had a pandemic plan, right? Where all your locations are work from home. So I'd say the first 2 to 3 months of the pandemic, looking back, was really around securing the business, both from an operational perspective and just quite frankly, from making sure we can, I won't say pay our bills, but understanding our customers and making sure we manage the risk in our business. And then coming out of it and getting into probably the latter half of the year, it started to shift around, hey, in this new environment, and particularly around our sales channel, how are we going to start selling again, right? We had field salespeople. You go and visited customers, and what are we doing? And so we really had to start to look at some of our digital solutions in that space. And so we started making some of those investments and changing processes. And a lot of good, I'd say there's a lot of good nuggets that came out of that we're going to take forward that, even in the new environment, we found we're more effective doing things this way as opposed to the pre-pandemic normal. So that was interesting. And our business continued to recover through the third and fourth quarter and into the first quarter here, although we're not quite back all the way in all the different geographies, although we're all getting very comfortable here in the US. Yeah, we can all go read the news, right? Not all countries are as fortunate as we are in terms of the pandemic recovery. And so we're still watching that, have certain locations that are obviously in a different state than we are here in the US.
Right. And I should have said, you're 6 lines of business. I think 6 lines of business
Yep.
when you look at it globally in dozens of countries. So I know sometimes when we're having conversations, it may apply to one line of business and not all, et cetera. But when you look back, let's look back a bit more and understand 2020. What did you have in place as a CIO? What did you have in place as a digital leader that, when March and April 2020 came around and we really started to feel the full impact of COVID, what allowed you to make the transitions that you necessarily had to make? I mean, was there anything that you done in 18 or 19 that just serendipitously really helped you out?
Yeah, it's interesting. I like the choice of the word serendipitously. We had done a pretty significant investment in some of our network backbone at the end of 2019 from a capital perspective and in the like, which really benefited us from a work from home perspective, right, in getting people in there. So we were not in a position of, hey, we got to go buy a ton of equipment and beef up our network and beef up some of our backbone. So that, I'd love to say that was great planning on my team's part, in my part, but that was beneficial. I think when we looked at the biggest challenge we had as we came out and the work from home was around some of the, more of the peripheral side, right? There was a big run on laptops and, small notebooks and soft phones and things like that. That was probably our biggest challenge. And we had done a really good job from a security perspective in terms of leveraging we leverage Citrix for some of our work from home people. So, we didn't have to enable software on their end, but they could VPN and leverage our common images to be able to do their work. So we had done some really good work around that space that allowed us to very quickly enable our call center folks and our support folks and sales folks to be able to work from home. Obviously, when you get into some more of the professional people, they were very used to VPNing in, they had their laptops, and so that wasn't a challenge for us from that perspective.
But you mentioned the PCI issue earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's workflow, and you had to change workflow to be remote, and that's not an easy task all the time. It sounds like
one of the challenges there it was interesting with some of our outsourced providers in foreign countries. Mexico and Costa Rica was, they have to be PCI certified for some of the things they do. Well, they had BCP, we had contracts that say they had BCP plans, but we really had to delve into what are you doing, right? So we had to spend time for our partners to really understand how they were doing this during the pandemic, and then be very prescriptive in terms of, okay, you can no longer do these functions. We're going to shift these functions over to our internal people because we're not comfortable with that work environment. So to your point, it was down to the process level in terms of what functions we had folks doing and moving some of that around to, secure facilities that we were comfortable with.
Got it. And let's spend a little bit of time. I don't know if it's looking backward or looking forward, but we, as you and I previously discussed to this call, how do you think about cyber and how do you think about fraud? Because supply chains, you could argue, are critical infrastructure. Energy, and you're in the fuel business historically, is critical. And now you're also in financial services and B2B payments. I mean, these are all tied up in security and cyber and fraud. And, without getting into specifics, what's your framework? How do you think about this stuff? How do you talk to your board about this stuff? You're doing this on a global basis in not one, but two verticals that are, mission critical. How do you hold the problem, Scott?
Yeah, it's a great point with our board tech committee. As I joked with you before, it's probably 60% of our topic and discussion when we meet on a quarterly basis. And, we use the NIST framework to kind of evaluate ourselves, right? And then we benchmark ourselves using various different benchmarks out there. And, we've done a good job investing ourselves in terms of our overall security stance. Obviously, being in the credit card business, we're subject to PCI standards, which and also SOC audits. So there's a lot of things we have to do just to meet our basic requirements and regulations. And so we've done a good job at that. We continue to invest. Doesn't end, right? One of the things I say with my CEO, he likes to think of capital projects and you depreciate it. We have to continue to spend more each year in cybersecurity because the bad guys get better and better. Right. So we're constantly adding new capabilities as we look at where the industry is going. But probably one of our more challenging areas gets around fraud. Right. And when you look at and have thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of customers that are connecting into your network, they're in a lot of times therein lies your weakest link. Right. And their susceptibility to being hacked or socially engineered. So it's not even technically hacked. They get social engineered and somebody gets their credentials and they're able to come on. So we have to do a lot in terms of, one, educating with our customers about how we will contact you, what we won't ask you to do, what we will ask you to do. And quite frankly, also invest in some tools at the back end just to look at suspicious transactions. And quite frankly, a lot of times we will be the ones contacting our customers around things we're seeing and informing them that they've been hacked, right? Hey, we saw this transaction or these transactions taking place, not normal for you. And they come back to find out that, yes, somebody clicked on an email that they got where they were spoofing Comdata or FLEETCOR, and somebody got their credentials and went online and started doing different things to get their money. So fraud is a large part of what we have to do as well. And it's not necessarily a technology solution all the times, although the fraud detection is, but certainly a lot of it's education, and a lot of it is helping our customers protect against themselves.
And you think over time, corporations in general are beginning to win that battle, or do you think it's a never-ending uphill slog on social engineering? And the psychology of people is they're going to read something and click on it. There'll be a payload in the email, or there'll be I
will say it's going to be more. It's the latter of your statements. I don't think it'll change. The bad guys will continue to find ways, whether they, hang a hat over themselves that they're doing it for the greater good. The Robin Hood effect, they will come after various companies. And so we have to continue to get better and better and in how we protect ourselves and how we protect our customers.
Yeah, got it. Let's switch gears. Let's look forward. We're halfway through 2021, 2022. The plan's already bolted down. We're going to execute on those beginning latter half of this year. But you're making this big. You continue to make this big shift into B2B payments. What what excites you from a technology perspective? Is it AI? Is it ML? Is it, new payment technologies? Is there, generally speaking, as a CIO and a digital leader, what are the kind of, technology bets, generally speaking, that you think are going to have the biggest payoff in the next, say, 5 years? And I'm not looking for vendor specific stuff, but just how do you frame that? How do you organize to look at it? I should say you were named one of the most innovative companies last year in the Southeast. I think there was a Georgia organization that named you an innovative company. So you're doing some things in this domain, but how do you think of innovation in that, in that box against, some potential technology buckets, or what's interesting from your perspective?
Yeah, it didn't. Big question, a lot of facets to that question. First, start from the business perspective, and in the B2B payments arena, it's still very paper and check oriented. So what gets us excited is just about the potential to digitize those payments, right? To move people away from check and paper invoices, and how do we get them onto various digital solutions, right? And so that's the first thing that excites us, is it's a big potential market that's been relatively fragmented. We have a large customer base on the fuel side that we can say, hey, how do we help them beyond their fuel side of their business move and digitize the rest of those payments? And it varies, across the different customer segments. We have a lot of SMB customers, so the technology solutions around that are going to be different than when we go look at our big enterprise customers. So that's the first thing that gets us excited, right? And that may not be AI or anything else. It's just, boy, you have a big market. How do we move them along? How do we go do that? So I'd say that's the first thing that we get excited about. Then when we look at, when I look at our IT and say, hey, where are we going to transform? We kind of set up a framework around, I'd say, 3 different areas that we're focusing on. First is what we call kind of our digital, we call it unified customer experience, UCX, but it's really about that digital interaction with our customers, which, to your point, 6 different LOBs, lines of businesses, from gift cards to payroll cards to B2B payments to fuel cards. That'll manifest itself in a lot of different ways. Some ways we're very familiar with from a consumer perspective, in terms of, how do we better enable things on the phone, and how do we do mobile payments on the phone and be able to do things there. To the interesting one is, we give virtual per diem cards in our travel business. We launched that, right? And that helps companies digitize that part of the process, move away from expense reports, and just say, hey, Mark, you're traveling for 2 days. Here's $50 on a virtual card that shows up in your phone. And then you can use that to pay your, and you've simplified that process. So there's various interesting things we're doing there around the digital side. So that UCX is a pretty big umbrella for a lot of the things we're doing with our front end tools with our customers. When I look at kind of our back end, there's 2 key things we're doing. One, we grew through acquisition, as you mentioned, right? So a lot of acquisition from a FLEETCOR perspective, which has, left us with a nice, how do I say it, bouquet of back end systems, right, over time. And we were so growth oriented that a large part of what we were doing was, acquiring those companies, tucking them in, and moving on to the next one. So now we have what I call our kind of core system modernization. And how do you look across these various platforms that, quite frankly, when you look at it from a services perspective, they all do a very similar thing. So we're looking and saying, hey, how do we look at the cloud and start to do kind of a microservices architecture and migrate over time, right? Not necessarily do a big bang, right, which can tend to be risky. So we've got a lot of effort going into a microservices-based kind of architecture and migrating those core transactional systems, and we call that our core system modernization strategy. And so we started doing that at the end of, as capital started to free up at the end of 2020, and we got more comfortable with our business here into 2021. And so that's exciting. And that gets more exciting is we're doing that just from a pure technology perspective, is actually when we see the intersection of, hey, that microservices architecture is not only helping us modernize and move to the cloud, but it's starting to solve business problems. And when the business starts to see, hey, as we're in this new architecture, we're more agile, we can do more things, right? We can move quicker, we can enable more capabilities. That gets really exciting for our folks. And we start to see some of those intersections that that's the stuff that gets us juiced up. We're able to do things that, maybe would have taken us 18 months in the old architecture, and we're doing it in 6 weeks. That's great, right? And the business gets real excited about that. And I'd say kind of the third leg of the stool, and we're just starting on this side, is around data. Right? When you think about the amount of data from a transactional perspective that goes through our network and the millions of transactions and level 3 type of data we get from our credit card processing, that's a treasure trove for us. So we're starting to say, hey, how do we better enable that data, right, to facilitate, and share with our customers and create more stickiness with them? How do we better share that data internally, whether it's to help facilitate fraud and help provide solutions to our customers that better help them prevent fraud on their end from the use of the various products we give them. And so that's kind of the third leg. So those are probably the 3 big things that we're doing. On the AI front, that's more going to be in our fraud side. All right, so it's a very targeted area for us when you start to talk about AI and analyzing transactions, as well as on the cybersecurity side. Right. So part of what we're doing on the cyber side as we look at some of our partners there and tools there is, certainly we put in place the necessary, infrastructure and the necessary software to protect ourselves, but to start to use AI to look for suspicious actors in transactions and locations and things like that. So we're starting to apply AI on that front as well.
I want to get back to the digitization question quickly. I want to follow up on what you said, and then I want to move to microservices, which is fascinating. We'll drill on that for a bit. But on the digitization side, I've always been perplexed, and this goes back. I'm easy to get perplexed for those that know me, but this goes back 20 years. You've lived in Europe. I've lived in Europe. We both today still do a lot of business in Europe. I think Europe is 20 years ahead of the U.S. in terms of checks. A European, they're still perplexed. We write checks to each other, and that is still the predominant way that we move money here. Why? And I just say, I'm not a payments expert, but why is there this 20-year gap where the Europeans a long time ago figured out how to do this, and we're still talking about digitizing checks? Because I don't suspect this is something you need to worry about in Europe. This is a North American centric problem. Where did we get it wrong, and why can't the U.S. close that gap quicker? I can't explain it. I get asked that probably every month, and I'm not a payments guy, but where's the nub of that problem at?
Well, if it was a simple answer, the problem probably wouldn't exist, right? So it's going to be cultural. It's going to be, hey, it's old habits. How do I benefit from it? So that's part of the challenge, right? Is convincing and articulating and people the solution. And then there hasn't been a centralized solution. So I think when you get to Europe and you get into countries and national, more centralized banking, that it's a little bit easier there, right? If you start to get around cross-border digitization in Europe, that's a bigger challenge, right? You get into different European directives, having played in that space, and how do I get digital certificates? And from my days at McKesson, it was interesting, when you had big partners, when you look at business in the US, when you have a big partner you do a lot of transactions with, you very quickly automate that, all right? You automate it from an order taking perspective, you automate it from whether it's EDI or XML, from a invoicing perspective, you automate those processes so you can eliminate people, right? So when you see a large part of that, it's the fragmentation that kills you when you have a lot of small vendors, right? How an individual company goes about digitizing that, it's not worth the investment, right? Because of all the people I have to deal with. So you need the centralized kind of partner solution to go drive and help you do that. And how do you get that network effect? And so that's where I think our bigger challenge. So I think in Europe, I do think they benefit from, hey, within a country, they tend to be a little bit more centralized. It's easier. If you look across countries, I don't think you see quite as much digitization. You see more paperwork, you see more European directives, you see more things you have to deal with.
Good answer. So you got the cultural piece on it, you got the fragmentation piece on it.
And just our sheer size.
The centralization, the industry structure. Understood, because I can never explain that. So thanks for kind of illuminating that. So let's then go circle back on the microservices one, which is fascinating. Sure. Unpack that microservices journey for us. Kind of when did it start? How did you think about it? What kind of architectural choices did you make? there's probably, looks like there's a couple dozen high profile microservices vendors out there that are all getting, tremendous amount of traction. I think it's one of the next big things we got to get right, from an
Right.
IT perspective, architecturally. So unpack that for us at FLEETCOR and how you went about it.
And I'll delve into one of our specific LOBs, maybe that grew lines of business. Sorry, I'll try to avoid the acronyms for the folks on the phone, right? From one of our lines of business. When you look at our fuel side, we've grown through acquisitions. So you found, hey, in terms of fuel card solutions, we had, 9, 10, 12, 11 of them out there, right? And then when you break them down and say, well, what services and functions do they do? You could come back and say, hey, there's 12 core services they do, and then maybe 1 or 2 unique things about that platform, right, for the particular segment that they play in. And so, when we looked at it from there, the first attempt prior to me at FLEETCOR was, hey, let's build one big new system and we're going to put everyone on that, right? So the kind of the big monolith approach, right? And that was challenging, right? And didn't quite work out. So we came back, we said, hey, this is more about, how do we break down services? And let's first attack pricing. And let's build out a pricing service. Let's put that in the cloud using our vendor of choice, to your point, on the services side. And then we'll plug that into these legacy systems. And so we kind of took a piecemeal approach or a evolutionary approach to that migration. And the advantage to that, because we started the journey, to your question, back during the pandemic, right? So we weren't going to get millions and millions of dollars of capital, but we wanted to start it. And the advantage of kind of that incremental approach is we can kind of move as fast or slow as we want to, based on how many services we want to go do, and we can control the risk, right? We don't want to do big bangs. We want to migrate over time. We want to get experience with this and understand how we can do the migration. So that's been our approach, and we've been going down that path with really starting in earnest, quite frankly, this year, going live with our first service this year and second service and third service up until now. And so also it gave us the advantage when we took that approach is looking across our fuel geographies and not just taking a North America approach, but saying, hey, let's try to do this looking at the European landscape as well, even though you're going to have some regulatory differences and some, process differences in terms of how they do business out there. But we've been doing that, trying to do it on a global basis as well.
Got it. And when you pull those out, for those less familiar with microservices, but when you isolate a service like pricing and you compartmentalize it, and it can be consumed by any parts of the business, and it plugs back into legacy, and it plugs into APIs. It's robust is the whole point.
Yeah. And to your point, Mark, when you look at before, if we want to do something around pricing, you got to go into 9 different systems, right? Legacy systems, and do it. So it came back to the agility that once you pull it out, hey, our ability to do it once, right, and quicker, and the agility it gives our business is, a large part of where the benefits case stood for us. We really looked at benefits around that whole transformation around, I'd say, kind of 4 key pillars. One was, operations. Hey, we got to get rid of legacy systems that we constantly have to patch and everything else. How do we modernize it, get it in the cloud, leverage redundancy of the cloud? So clearly there was an operations bent to it. There was a cost bent to it, right? Hey, we don't have to buy servers or capital, the multitude of different people managing the different technology stacks. So there was a cost component, a security component. Hey, it's easier to secure once it's in one place and surround it and look at it. And then finally was the agility, right? And we really started to talk to our business stakeholders, the agility component. When you looked at, hey, the risk of doing this type of transformation, the effort that had to go into it. If you're just looking at cost or operations, you might say, no, I'm not interested. It's not the bet I want to play. I want to put my capital somewhere else. When you looked at the agility side, that was the one that really got people excited, which is great.
That's wonderful. 2 quick questions. We're going to wrap up here in about 2 minutes, but real quick, any downsides to that migration of microservices, or things you're probably not going to be able to do in the near term, or speed bumps, walls? Is there another side to that story that you'd caution other digital leaders and CIOs to carefully consider?
The downside of the thing to consider is, as you look at, is you don't want to replicate everything. So part of our answer is you acquired all these different companies. They have legacy processes. It's not unlike your infamous given my background, ERP implementations. You don't want to just automate and take your old processes and put them on, right? There's things you want to take advantage of and say, hey, we're going to not only re-engineer the technology around this, but we're going to look at the process and not just move everything we've previously done into this new microservice. And getting the right people engaged from the business to do that is one of your bigger challenges, just like it is on an ERP migration to make those decisions. So I'd say that would be the thing that is very easy just to replicate everything you currently do on a newer technology. And it's the age-old story. I'm probably not telling people anything they don't know there, but it applies in the cloud as it did on your SAP system or Oracle ERP system as well.
No, great. Scott, 30 minutes goes quick. We're just about out of time. I got one last question, and I call it the Nugget. I close all these interviews every week with the same question, and that is, what's in your toolkit? What's the one technique, process? What's your go-to thing that you can pull out and use to get some results that perhaps other digital leaders may not be thinking about or maybe new to them, but what's a go-to tool that everyone that's worked with Scott knows at some stage he's going to pull out and use again? That's one of your go-to techniques or things.
Sure, and I apologize for the sirens in the background here in Buckhead or Atlanta, Georgia, but they're quieted down. We quite often we all talk about people, right? People are our largest asset. What do you do? But the question is, well, how do you unlock that? Right. And I took a course, I don't remember how many years ago, and it was a leadership course talking about the different type of leaders. And one of the things they talked about was a concept called multipliers, right? And they talked about kind of the dynamics and habits of really strong leaders that multiply and get the most out of them. And what I took away from that was, one, context setting. As a leader, you tend to be involved in a lot more of the strategy sessions, the important sessions, and it's very easy to come out of there and just start dictating and telling people, here's what we're going to go do. But giving people context as to the why. Here's what we're trying to accomplish, why we're trying to do that, and make sure that cascades through your organization, that you unlock and get a lot more out of your people, right? Because they understand the context as to why. So, you can call that coaching, you can call that, just making sure people, but quite often I find leaders just assume people understand the why, and they just start talking about the doing, but spending time with people about the why and what we're trying to accomplish. You'd be amazed at the ideas and the productivity that you get out of your team when you spend time to do that. So that's a one thing I take out of the people side, how we go about managing some of the cultural change I try to drive here.
Context is 20 IQ points, it sounds like.
That's right.
Scott, wonderful. Really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day today. Some great insights. This has been streamed out to social media. We're going to post it on the website, but some real nuggets. I wish we had more time. Certainly there could be follow-up, but the whole microservices conversation, we could have gone a couple of hours on. I find that stuff fascinating for the companies to get that right. They're really going to benefit from. So on behalf of CIONET, thanks again. For our regular viewers, same time next week. We've got a full agenda throughout the summer of some wonderful speakers like Scott. Enjoy your summer, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week as well. Thanks again, Scott.